The sun hung heavy over the vast Persian plateau, pouring down its relentless light upon the ochre earth. In the distance, the mountains shimmered like faint mirages, their rocky slopes softened by the haze of heat. Between them stretched the deserts and fertile valleys of ancient Persia, where life was always a delicate dance with nature. For in this land, summers burned fiercely, and the challenge of keeping food, water, and spirits cool was a struggle older than memory itself. And yet, in this harsh land, the Persians had built something extraordinary. They called it the Yakhchal, literally, ice pit. From the outside, it looked like a giant beehive of clay rising high into the air, its curved dome catching the desert sun. But inside, deep below the surface, lay chambers of silence and cold. Even in the hottest days of midsummer, one could step inside and feel the breath of winter whisper against the skin. To a traveler approaching for the first time, the Yakhchal seemed almost magical. Imagine walking through the dusty streets of an ancient Persian town. The scent of baked bread drifts from the market. Children chase each other between narrow alleys. Merchants call out, their voices mixing with the bray of donkeys and the clatter of wheels on stone. And then, as you turn a corner, you see it. A towering dome of mud brick, smooth and curved, standing apart like a silent guardian of secrets. The townsfolk knew what it was, of course. The Yakhchal was the keeper of ice. During winter, when the nights grew cold, pools of water were frozen in shallow canals, sometimes shaded by tall walls that captured the chill of the night air. The slabs of ice were cut, carried, and stored deep inside the Yakhchal, layered with straw and insulated by thick walls of mud, ash, and sand. These walls were more than 2 meters thick, designed to repel the desert heat. What began as simple human ingenuity became, over centuries, a tradition, almost a ritual of survival. Inside, the air was cool, dim, and hushed. If you stepped into the chamber, you would hear only the faint echo of your own breath, perhaps the distant dripping of water melting slowly from the ice blocks. The Yakhchal was not just storage, it was a time machine, a link between the burning summer day and the frozen nights of winter. It held not only food and drink, but also the promise of festivals, weddings, and relief for the weary. For the people of Persia, this mastery of cold was more than practical, it was spiritual. Fire was sacred in their faith, the eternal flame of Zoroastrian temples never allowed to die. But alongside fire, there was reverence for water, for purity, and for the balance of opposites. To create a home for ice in the heart of the desert was to show harmony with the elements, to prove that even in the harshest climates, human hands could shape nature without breaking it. And so, the Yakhchal stood, season after season, generation after generation. Its domed silhouette became part of the landscape, as familiar as the mosque or the marketplace. Farmers brought melons and grapes to keep fresh. Nobles ordered chilled sherbets for their feasts. Children whispered stories about spirits that guarded the cold chambers, spirits who would punish those who wasted water or disrespected the ice. In the evenings, when the heat of the day gave way to the cooler desert winds, the families of the town might gather near the Yakhchal. Some came to collect blocks of ice, wrapped in straw, others simply to rest in its shadow, where the air seemed a little fresher. And all of them knew that without this great invention, their summers would have been harsher, their food shorter-lived, their joy dimmed. The Yakhchal was, in its quiet way, a miracle. Not a miracle of gods, but of people, of architects, builders, and dreamers who understood both the sky above and the earth below. And in the story of the Yakhchal, we glimpse the story of Persia itself, a civilization that thrived not by conquering nature, but by learning how to live with it in balance, in harmony, in wisdom. This is where our journey begins, with a dome of clay in the desert, holding within it the memory of winter and the promise of survival. If you stood in Persia long ago, watching the desert at night, you might notice something strange. The days were blistering, but when the sun sank beyond the horizon, the air cooled quickly. In some valleys, frost even touched the ground before dawn. It was in this rhythm, this dance between fire and ice, that the Persians found their secret. They built long, high walls called Shabistan, or wind-catch walls, stretching east to west. These walls cast deep shadows on shallow pools of water dug at their base. At night, the water would freeze, kissed by the chill desert air. By morning, thin sheets of ice formed, ready to be gathered. Men and women worked quietly, lifting the fragile slabs before the sun rose too high. They carried them, wrapped in straw and cloth, into the waiting chambers of the Yakchal. This work was more than labor, it was almost sacred. Imagine the silence of those desert nights, stars burning fiercely above, jackals calling in the distance, the whisper of wind brushing over sand. In the stillness, the people bent to their task, touching the frozen surface of the pools as though touching a gift from the heavens. The walls themselves were marvels of design. They were built tall enough to block sunlight all day long, ensuring that water stayed cold. And because the desert air was so dry, evaporation carried away heat, cooling the pools even further. The Persians did not fight nature, they cooperated with it, turning weakness into strength. Once inside the Yakchal, the ice was carefully layered. A block of ice, then a blanket of straw. Another block, more straw. Layer upon layer until the deep pit inside the dome was filled. The thick conical walls, sometimes more than 2 meters thick, kept the heat out. The dome itself curved upward like a funnel, drawing warm air away through a small opening at the top. Even at the peak of summer, when the earth cracked and the air shimmered, the Yakchal held its cold breath. But the Yakchal was not only about survival, it was about celebration. In noble houses, sherbets, sweet drinks flavored with fruit juice, rose water, and herbs, were chilled with ice and served to honored guests. In the markets, merchants sold cool water mixed with honey or pomegranate, drawing crowds eager for relief from the heat. At weddings and festivals, ice became a symbol of abundance and joy, a sign that a family was prosperous enough to offer the rarest of gifts, coolness in the desert. For children, the Yakchal was a place of wonder. They whispered tales that spirits lived inside, guardians of the cold, who would punish anyone greedy or careless. Some said that if you pressed your ear against the dome at night, you could hear the ice dreaming, whispering stories of winter snows in faraway mountains. Others believed that the Yakchal was alive, that it breathed, that it remembered all who entered its chamber. To the builders, though, it was the proof of human genius. Mud brick, clay, ash, and sand, simple materials drawn from the earth itself, combined to form a structure that defeated the desert sun. No mortar of stone, no steel, no glass, just earth, shaped with wisdom, aligned with the stars and the winds. Every summer, as the heat grew unbearable, people gave thanks for the Yakchal. Farmers returned from their fields with baskets of grapes, cucumbers, and melons, storing them in the cool interior. Water carriers brought pitchers to keep fresh for longer journeys. Even soldiers marching through the empire found refreshment in its icy chambers, their spirits lifted by the touch of cold water on their lips. The Yakchal was more than a building, it was a bond between generations. Fathers taught sons the art of freezing water beneath the desert sky. Mothers passed down recipes for sherbets that tasted of snow and sunlight. Elders told stories of the first Yakchals built centuries ago by kings who wished to preserve not only their wealth, but also the joy of their people. And so through ice, the Persians learned patience. They waited for the long nights of winter to gift them with frost. They worked quietly, gathering, storing, layering. And when the burning days arrived,
They did not fear, for they knew that beneath the dome, winter still slept, waiting to be awakened. This was the craft of ice in the desert, simple, ingenious, profound. A lesson in harmony, a testament to endurance, and a reminder that even in the harshest climates, humanity could carve beauty out of necessity.
When dawn spread its pale light across the Persian desert, the village began to stir. Merchants opened their stalls, farmers prepared their donkeys, and children ran through narrow streets, laughing. But in the heart of the settlement stood a quiet giant, the Yakchal, its domed shape rising like a slumbering mountain of clay. For many families, the Yakchal was more than a landmark. It was part of their daily rhythm. Farmers brought freshly harvested melons, cucumbers, and grapes, carrying them into the cool chamber so that the fruit would stay fresh for days instead of hours. Merchants used the chill of the ice to preserve dairy or store water that travelers could buy before crossing the endless stretches of desert. Imagine a summer afternoon, the sun blazing so fiercely that the air itself seemed to shimmer. In that heat, stepping into the Yakchal was like entering another world. The air was cool, the smell of earth thick and calming, the silence deep. A child would press his hands against the blocks of ice, eyes wide in wonder, while his mother reminded him to take only what was needed. The ice must last, she would whisper, as if speaking too loudly might melt it away. For nobles and the wealthy, ice brought luxury. Servants carried small chunks of frozen water wrapped in cloth back to the kitchens of grand estates. There, cooks prepared chilled dishes, bowls of fruit cooled on ice, sherbets flavored with mint and rosewater, and even wine served refreshingly cold on nights of feasting. To offer such delights in the heat of Persia was not only hospitality, but a sign of prestige. Guests would marvel, how does this house hold winter in its hands? But it was not only the rich who tasted this miracle. On market days, vendors sold drinks chilled with slivers of Yakchal ice. Travelers returning from the desert bought clay cups of pomegranate water, made cool with the touch of frozen shards. For a few coins, even a farmer or shepherd could experience, if only briefly, the joy of snow in the middle of summer. The Yakchal also held a spiritual presence. Many believed it was a gift from the gods, a structure that connected the people with forces greater than themselves. Priests sometimes spoke of the Yakchal as a sacred space where the balance between fire and water, heat and cold, life and death was preserved. Stories told by elders compared the ice within to the eternal soul, hidden, enduring, untouched by the flames of the world. Children wove their own legends. Some whispered that a jinn lived in the Yakchal, guarding its icy treasure. Others claimed that at night, when the moon was full, you could hear the ice sing softly, like a lullaby from the mountains. The Yakchal, they said, was alive. It dreamed, it breathed, it remembered. Even the empire itself relied on these frozen vaults. Couriers on long journeys carried ice to cool their water. Armies found relief in icy drinks after dusty marches. In times of famine, when crops withered in the heat, the preserved fruits and water from the Yakchal provided hope. In this way, the Yakchal was not only a marvel of engineering, but a foundation of community. It stood at the center of life, practical, spiritual, and symbolic. Its walls held not just ice, but the memories of festivals, the laughter of children, the relief of farmers, and the prayers of elders.
In the royal courts of ancient Persia, ice was never just a practical commodity, it was a dazzling symbol of wealth, control, and mastery over nature. Imagine stepping into the grand palace of Persepolis during the reign of Darius or Xerxes. The hall is filled with golden vessels, vibrant carpets, and the aromas of roasted lamb and saffron rice. But the true marvel is what appears on the banquet tables: bowls of chilled fruit, cups of wine cooled with snow, and sherbet-like drinks flavored with pomegranate and mint. For a guest from Greece, Babylon, or India, this was nothing short of sorcery. The very act of serving ice was a declaration. The King of Kings commands not only armies and territories, but even the seasons themselves. While ordinary peasants sweated in the summer heat, the Persian elite enjoyed the taste of winter in the middle of July. In an empire that stretched from the burning deserts of Egypt to the lush valleys of the Indus, ice became an ultimate marker of privilege. Persian physicians, too, valued ice. Court healers sometimes prescribed chilled water for fevers or snow compresses for swelling and injuries. To cool the blood was a phrase often used in their medical tradition. Drinking cold water was thought to restore balance when the body was overheated by the harsh sun of the Iranian plateau. Thus, ice was not only luxury but also medicine, though only the wealthy could afford such treatments. The logistics behind this miracle added to the wonder. Servants, soldiers, and laborers worked tirelessly to transport snow from the mountains to the cities. In summertime, entire caravans were sent to fetch snow, packed tightly into straw and wool, to preserve it during the long journey. When the blocks arrived at the palace, they were stored in vast subterranean ice houses, the yakhchels, whose domes rose like silent guardians above the desert sands. The very sight of these structures must have impressed foreign visitors, proof that Persian engineering could bend the environment to human will. Stories from travelers suggest that foreign dignitaries were astonished by this marvel. Greek writers who visited Persia described the sumptuous feasts of the Achaemenid court, where endless trays of chilled grapes, figs, and melon were served. To them, it seemed like a fairy tale. How could a land so hot provide a taste of snow? Even later Roman emperors, who prided themselves on luxury, copied the Persian tradition by importing ice and snow for banquets. But in Persia, ice was more than a luxury, it was political theater. When a satrap or ambassador was served a cool drink in the presence of the King of Kings, it was a demonstration of imperial power. It said, "In this land, even the impossible is possible." To master ice was to master nature itself. This blend of engineering, medicine, and spectacle made ice one of the greatest symbols of Persian innovation. It was both practical and mystical, a bridge between the natural world and the splendor of the empire. To sit in a hall cooled with snow, drinking chilled wine in the blazing heat of summer, was to feel for a moment that one had stepped outside the limits of time and season.
If the Persian kings dazzled their guests with ice, the secret behind this marvel was hidden in the desert itself, the yakhchal. These towering dome-shaped structures, some of them still standing after more than 2,000 years, were among the greatest achievements of ancient Persian engineering. To the untrained eye, a yakhchal might look like a giant clay beehive rising above the sand. But step closer, and you would discover that this was no ordinary building. It was a refrigerator the size of a house. The word yakhchal means ice pit. At its core, each structure contained a vast subterranean chamber dug deep into the ground and lined with a special mixture of clay, sand, egg whites, and even goat hair. This material, known as sarouge, was waterproof and insulated so well that it could keep ice solid for months, even through the blazing Persian summer. Imagine standing inside one of these chambers. The air would be cool and damp, echoing softly against the curved walls, with blocks of ice stacked neatly in the shadows like treasure hoarded from winter. But the genius of the yakhchal was not only in its walls. The Persians designed them to work with the environment, not against it. At night, when the desert air grew cold, water would be channeled into shallow pools near the yakhchal. The wide, flat surfaces allowed the water to freeze, even under the open sky. By dawn, workers collected the thin layers of ice and carried them into the subterranean chamber, stacking them block by block. Layer after layer, they filled the pit until it became a frozen mountain hidden underground. Ventilation shafts added another brilliant feature. Warm air would rise through the dome's hollow passages, while cool air sank into the chamber. This natural air circulation created a primitive but effective refrigeration system. To stand at the entrance of a yakshal on a sweltering summer day was to feel a sudden rush of coolness, as if stepping into another season. What is remarkable is not just the technology itself, but the foresight it required. The yakshals were community projects, built by entire towns under the guidance of skilled architects. Farmers, merchants, and officials all contributed, knowing that the stored ice would be used for more than royal banquets. Ordinary people, too, benefited from chilled water during droughts, preserved food for longer, and even cooled their homes with blocks of ice placed in clay vessels. To a traveler crossing Persia, the sight of a yakshal must have been unforgettable. Rising like an earthen dome in the middle of the desert, it seemed almost magical, a promise that inside the essence of winter was waiting, hidden in the earth. And yet, it was not magic. It was human ingenuity, harnessing physics, climate, and craftsmanship centuries before the first mechanical refrigerator was ever imagined. In this way, the yakshal was more than a building. It was a testament to Persian resilience, the ability to thrive in a harsh landscape, to bend nature not by force, but through harmony with its rhythms. Where others saw an endless desert, the Persians saw an opportunity to create cold from heat and abundance from scarcity.
The yakshal was not merely a storage chamber, it was a bridge between worlds. The grandeur of royal luxury and the daily lives of ordinary Persians. At the heart of this system was a simple but powerful truth. Ice was a treasure, and its use revealed much about Persian society. For the royal courts, ice was a symbol of status and power. Imagine a summer banquet in Persepolis. Nobles reclining on soft carpets embroidered with gold thread, peacock feather fans waving in the air, musicians playing gentle tunes on lyres and flutes. Servants would appear carrying silver trays of chilled sherbets, saffron, rosewater, pomegranate, and grape, sparkling like jewels in crystal bowls. Guests marveled as they sipped these icy drinks under the blazing July sun. To enjoy winter in the middle of summer felt like bending nature itself, a reminder of the king's divine authority to command the impossible. At times, ice was used for medicine within the royal household. If a noble suffered from fever or swelling, physicians recommended cool compresses made with snow or ice. The sensation of relief in such heat must have felt almost miraculous. But ice was not reserved only for kings. Ordinary Persians, too, experienced its wonders. Each morning, workers would emerge from the yakshal and distribute small blocks of ice to townsfolk. Families carried the chunks wrapped in straw or clay jars, rushing before the sun could melt them. At home, the ice was used to cool drinking water, preserve milk and yogurt, or prepare simple frozen treats. Crushed ice mixed with honey, dates, or grape syrup. Children squealed with laughter as they pressed their palms against the ice, shocked by its chill, and then licked the melting drops from their fingers. For a farmer returning from the fields, a cup of water cooled by yakshal ice was more than refreshment, it was life itself. For merchants and travelers stopping at caravanserais along the royal road, being offered chilled water was considered a gesture of the highest hospitality, as valuable as food or shelter. Ice also carried spiritual significance. In Zoroastrian belief, the four elements, fire, water, earth, and air, were sacred and had to be protected. To preserve water in its frozen form was to safeguard one of these holy gifts. Priests sometimes blessed water drawn from the yakshal before rituals, seeing it as especially pure. Poets and philosophers also drew lessons from ice. In their verses, ice symbolized the fleeting nature of time. No matter how carefully stored, Every block eventually melted, just as youth fades and life itself slips away. Drinking from the ice was both a joy and a meditation on impermanence. It reminded Persians to savor what was precious before it vanished. The storage and trade of ice became its own small economy. Workers who harvested and packed the ice during winter were paid by officials or wealthy families. In some regions, caravans carried ice wrapped in straw, transporting it along the royal road to distant cities. Imagine the astonishment of a traveler arriving in a hot desert outpost only to be served water cooled by ice brought from mountains or yakchals hundreds of miles away. Markets adapted as well. Vendors began selling cooled fruit, chilled dairy, and sherbets flavored with herbs. Ice gave rise to new tastes, new luxuries, and even new forms of medicine. Honey mixed with snow, for example, was prescribed for stomach troubles, while lotus-flavored ice water was thought to calm the nerves. But ice was more than comfort. It was a reminder of the delicate balance between man and nature. To have ice in the desert was to prove human ingenuity. To share it, whether in palaces or simple homes, was to show generosity and community spirit. The yakchal, then, was not only an engineering wonder, but a cultural one. It united Persians in their pursuit of comfort, health, and beauty. It turned the cruel heat of the desert into an opportunity for celebration. And it carried with it meaning that went far beyond the cold itself, a symbol of life, luxury, and the wisdom of balance.
For the Persians, the story of ice did not end in the vaults of the yakchal or the cups of sherbet at a banquet. Ice seeped into their imagination, inspiring poetry, travel accounts, and legends that transformed this practical substance into something almost magical. Persian poets, always eager to weave the ordinary into the sublime, found endless metaphors in ice. In their verses, ice symbolized purity, a heart untouched by passion, or the fleeting beauty of youth. One poet might compare the lips of a beloved to chilled pomegranate juice, their freshness able to revive even the most weary soul. Another might write of love that melted like ice under the heat of longing. The contrast between burning desire and freezing cold became a favorite theme. To drink from an ice-cooled cup was not just pleasure, it was poetry incarnate, a moment where nature's extremes kissed in harmony. Travelers, too, left behind testimonies of their astonishment at Persian ice. Greek envoys at the Achaemenid court wrote in wonder of chilled drinks served in the middle of the blazing desert. Later, Arab chroniclers praised the ingenuity of Persian engineers, marveling at how they trapped the winter within walls of earth. Even Chinese records carried along the Silk Road mention the luxurious ice of Persia, describing it as a wonder of the western lands. To those who came from outside, the yakchal seemed like sorcery. How could desert dwellers summon frost in the heart of summer? Legends began to form around this marvel. One tale spoke of a king who promised to grant a wish to the architect who built the first great yakchal. The man asked not for gold, but for the chance that every poor child in the kingdom could taste ice once in their life. Moved, the king decreed that ice from the royal store would be shared with the people during festivals. Another story told of a wandering dervish who meditated in the desert heat until he fainted. Villagers revived him by giving him ice water from the yakchal, and he proclaimed that the coolness on his tongue felt like a glimpse of paradise. From that time on, Persians said that ice was borrowed from heaven. Even philosophy touched on ice. Zoroastrian scholars debated its symbolic role. Was it a form of water and therefore sacred, or was it something in between matter and spirit, frozen in transformation? Some saw it as a metaphor for wisdom, still and clear, but always melting if not preserved with care. Later Sufi mystics compared ice to the human soul, cold and hard when untouched, yet capable of flowing when warmed by divine love.
the people themselves created traditions around it. In certain villages, the first block of ice drawn from the Yakchal at the start of summer was sprinkled with saffron and shared among elders as a blessing for health and prosperity. Children would carve tiny sculptures from small pieces, crafting icy birds or flowers before they vanished in the sun. Lovers exchanged cups of chilled rose water as tokens of affection, believing that drinking together from ice-cold water bound their hearts as surely as any oath. Thus, ice became more than utility. It became myth. It told stories of kings and beggars, poets and mystics, of the human longing to control nature and the human awe at being surprised by it. When a Persian held ice in his hand, he did not just feel the cold. He felt the weight of history, poetry, and mystery condensed into a single fleeting moment.
As centuries passed, the image of the Persian ice houses, the great domes of the Yakchal rising from the desert floor, became more than just architecture. They became symbols of continuity, ingenuity, and cultural pride. Travelers arriving from distant lands marveled at these strange structures, with their smooth mud brick exteriors and subterranean chambers hidden beneath. To them, it seemed as though Persia had captured a piece of winter and held it hostage in the heart of summer. Inside these chambers, darkness and silence reigned. Great blocks of ice, gathered from frozen rivers in winter, lay stacked in careful layers, insulated by straw and clay. Even when the sun outside burned with relentless fury, the air within remained cool, almost sacred. Entering a Yakchal was like stepping into another world, where time moved differently and nature's rules were bent by human hands. It was not only the preservation of ice, but the preservation of knowledge, a living monument to the harmony between human invention and the natural environment. The Yakchal also served as a bridge across generations. Fathers would bring their sons to the structures, explaining how their ancestors had mastered the art of survival. Mothers, during festivals, would tell their children stories about kings who feasted on chilled sherbets and healers who cured fevers with the touch of cold water. The domes were not silent. They spoke through memory, through myth, and through the quiet pride of a people who knew that they had conquered the desert, not by defeating it, but by working with it. As empires rose and fell, the Yakchal endured. The Greeks, the Romans, and later the Arabs each encountered these marvels and carried fragments of the knowledge away with them in different forms. Yet it was in Persia that the tradition remained strongest, a thread unbroken even as dynasties changed and cities shifted. The mud domes became part of the landscape itself, blending into the desert as naturally as mountains and dunes. And just as the desert was eternal, so too did the art of cooling live on. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the Yakchal lies not in the stones and bricks, but in the idea it represents, that human beings, fragile as they are, can reshape their world with imagination and persistence. The people of Persia could not change the desert sun, nor could they stop the cycles of heat and drought, yet they refused to accept limitation. By digging deep, by learning the patterns of wind and shadow, they created a pocket of eternity, an oasis carved from ingenuity itself. Even today, many of these structures still stand, weathered but proud. Villagers still remember how their ancestors harvested ice, how sherbets flavored with rosewater cooled the throats of kings, how a child's laughter echoed on a summer evening as a piece of melting ice slipped through his fingers. And for those who visit these ancient domes, there is a moment of awe, a realization that long before electricity, long before modern refrigeration, a civilization dared to dream of capturing winter in the heart of summer. The story of the Persian refrigerator, then, is more than a tale of architecture or survival. It is a reminder that progress is not always about force or domination, but about harmony, patience, and vision. In the quiet domes of the Yakchal, beneath the desert stars,
The people of Persia left behind a message as clear as ice itself. Wisdom is the truest form of power, and those who learn to live with nature rather than against it will always find a way to endure.